Recently, I had my first introduction to Silent Hill. As one could guess, I played Silent Hill 1. I went into the game with reasonably high expectations. I mean, people praise Silent Hill, they say it's one of the best franchises, some say it is the best franchise, but after playing the game, after exploring the dark and eerie town, after meeting the so intricately crafted characters, I came out disappointed. This game that so many rave about just wasn't that interesting to me. Don't get me wrong, there are some things that Silent Hill does objectively correct. The story and psychological horror of Silent Hill as a whole is practically undefeated. The soundtrack is easily the best part, setting every scene perfectly with melancholy tones or the thrashing, more intense sounds. But my main complaint with Silent Hill 1 was the less than underwhelming gameplay and the atmosphere and locations. I couldn't get past being bored from the ever so mundane locations such as the school or the hospital, especially since the areas tend to all look the same with copy and paste rooms and just extremely bland textures. Despite all this, I figured I'd give Silent Hill another chance, a chance to see if maybe I would only have the problems with the first game. Maybe the second game would remedy all the downfalls of the first. So I played Silent Hill 2, and I must say, I was disappointed. At first. Similar to Silent Hill 1, Silent Hill 2 is a monumental horror game, hands down one of the most popular games in general ever made. I mean, when you think of Silent Hill, the first thing that most people think of is Geometric Man. Pyramid Head, but still, that's Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 takes what Silent Hill 1 does and expands upon it. However, instead of solely trying to make a better game, they doubled down on the psychological aspects to, once again, give a beautiful, ageless story. Now, I said earlier that I was disappointed, and that's probably because I was expecting something completely different from Silent Hill 1, which just isn't the case. However, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the game and what it does. In fact, I'd likely recommend it to someone looking for a good horror game, even though I myself just wouldn't be as inclined to play it. At the beginning of the game, you're introduced to James Sunderland, looking at himself through a mirror, which seems to be a recurring theme throughout the game. He seems like a normal guy, nothing really special, nothing really unique. Regardless, he still brought to Silent Hill. The reason is to find his dead wife that passed away 3 years ago. Yeah, James might be a bit loony, but look, he has a note that says so.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
James's wife, Mary, somehow sent this to James after her death, and now James is determined to find her. On the way to the town, we stop by a graveyard, in which we meet Angela, who is also brought here but to find her family. She tells us that the town may be dangerous, but James could care less and proceeds anyway. Actually making our way into the town, everything seems normal for the most part. Just a foggy, lonely town. That is, of course, until you come across this tunnel and you see something horrific. Along with the screeching noise of a radio, a man is being eaten by some sort of monster. In response, James grabs the nearest thing he sees and bashes it to death. It's not until after that where the true horror of Silent Hill really begins. From here on out, the town shows its true colors, throwing everything it can after you. And I talk about the town as if it's a character, and that's mostly because it is, but more on that later. The opening of Silent Hill 2 is rather mundane, not much really happens. It's simply just a man walking through a town, but I think that's exactly what the goal was. After just being told the town is dangerous, you walk in and there's nothing really. Some fog maybe, a little eerie, but other than that, it's just a town. And this causes an extreme juxtaposition when the seemingly normal town turns into something more sinister. And this has a perfect tone for the game too, the act of having something friendly or normal be turned into something from your nightmares. For the gameplay, I honestly could just copy and paste my notes from the Silent Hill 1 video. It's pretty much the exact same. Walk through the town, find a location, go through said location, rinse and repeat. That was to be expected though, so no complaints there. Besides the fact that, once again, this game is partly a walking simulator, especially in the actual town. They even have a tracker for how many kilometers you walk and run at the end of the game. Guys, they're becoming self-aware. As far as the combat goes, once again, it's just about the same. A whole bunch of ammo for your gun that's barely useful anyway, since you can just run past most of the enemies. Although I will say that there's a lot more times where it becomes beneficial to kill the enemies as opposed to SH1. The enemies seem more aggressive and getting in your way more, causing more of a need to put a couple bullets in their skull. That being said, I will say that most of the enemies are worth being killed with a melee weapon rather than using ammo. And this is actually something I like. A complaint I had with Silent Hill 1 was the lack of need to use melee weapons, as they just ended up being an eyesore in the inventory. But in Silent Hill 2, if there's a couple monsters in the hallway, I actually found it easier to take out the first weapon you get and use that, especially if the enemy had no weapon itself. The weapons that can be acquired in this game are about as expected. There's a pistol, shotgun, rifle, and melee weapons. There are some new game only weapons too, like the chainsaw and spray that obliterate a lot of enemies. Nothing exactly special, but of course, the gameplay isn't the focus of Silent Hill. One of the biggest focuses of any Silent Hill game is the atmosphere. Offering one of the eeriest atmospheres in any horror game, at least to most people, Silent Hill makes you really feel like you're alone and isolated in a town disconnected from civilization. Silent Hill 2, of course, is no exception, and many believe that this game does it the best. From the silent footsteps from walking in the hotel, to the prison located under the History Center, each location sets the atmosphere perfectly, once again, at least for most people. As you might have guessed, I'm not one of those people. The atmosphere just doesn't do it for me. I don't get the same chills down my spine that every Silent Hill fan makes an obligation to mention. I don't find the once normal locations that have become abandoned that eerie, and I really don't find the alternate versions of those same locations that intriguing. I found myself becoming more and more bored than anything. I just ended up treating every area as something blocking me from the next cutscene. Now admittedly, there was a couple of times when I started to feel uneasy, and dare I say, a little scared. Sitting in the apartments long enough really made me feel weird. Maybe it was the lack of music and the sound of the footsteps, or maybe it was the anxiety of wondering when Pyramid Head would show up randomly and attack me, even though he never did. Another more eerie area was the Silent Hill Historic Center. Of course, that includes the prison and house underneath. This area as a whole is probably my second favorite area in the game, which isn't saying much, but I digress. I think here it was mostly the ambient noises that got me. Even knowing that most likely nothing would happen, it still frightened me. And I have to mention the house area in particular, seemingly being a twisted version of Angela's house as you walk in the lonely halls until you find Angela herself. Similar to James, she's confronting her demons, and what you see here is her dad, or the official name, Abstract Daddy. I'm not too sure what they were thinking. Essentially, it's an amalgamation of two people on a bed frame. The reason being is that Angela was sexually abused by her dad. My point is that the overall atmosphere of this area really provides something special. From the endless hallways to the pistons coming through Angela's room, it depicts a perfect picture of her psyche. Now I did say that was my second favorite area of the game. My favorite area in the game isn't even something meant to be scary. Soon after the first time we meet Maria in Rosewater Park, she tells us to make our way to the hospital. However, on the way there we find Heaven's Night. It's a bowling alley, and apparently, bowling is so horrid that Maria just must stay outside. Walking in, we see Eddie and Laura talking friendly. They're safe without much worry. Surely enough, James is actually the one who breaks that safety. As soon as Laura sees James, she gets scared and runs off. I mean, understandably so, but that's more fleshed out later. Eddie just sits dormant enjoying his pizza in these lowly times. Regardless, this place is abandoned, as every place is in Silent Hill. But despite that, it's still lively. The glaring neon lights provide color in the otherwise bland palette. The music that plays here makes you feel calm, like nothing can get you, like this is a safe haven. Honestly, it feels like a Resident Evil safe room. Well, that fills my quota. Look, this is the game trying to compete with Resident Evil, so I gotta mention it. Anyway, a Resident Evil safe room makes you feel a relief from the horrors outside, making you feel like it's the only true safety one can get. Tracks like Serenity and Safe Haven make you feel extremely calm and safe, while also letting you know that the safety won't last forever. You'll have to eventually go back out and face the endless nightmares that await. I say all that to say that Heaven's Night recreates that feeling perfectly for me. In some cases even better. I really like the contrast in light that comes from the neon fixtures as I mentioned earlier. Typically, in Resident Evil, the safe rooms are just bland, but Heaven's Night isn't. The vibrant juxtaposition amplifies that feeling of safety even more. Arguably the strongest part of any Silent Hill game is the characters. It's either that or the soundtrack. I mean, why else would you play the game, right? Anyway, just like Silent Hill 1, the characters don't disappoint. First, we're introduced to James. I mentioned it earlier, but he's come to Silent Hill to find his dead wife. However, with this being Silent Hill, it's a bit deeper than that. James was really brought here to face his demons and come to terms with his depression and guilt. Characters like Pyramid Head is a manifestation of the punishment James thinks he deserves. James isn't really a good guy, and Silent Hill makes him realize that. Laura even knows this, as James clearly did something to Mary that made her upset. Mary seemed to be the only one who truly loved James, and James may have taken advantage of that. Mary is the late wife of James. Not too terribly much is known about her besides that she died 3 years ago, even though James seems to think otherwise. We know that she was sick and that's how she died, and even a couple of notes were seemingly left by her. She was likely nice and loving and treated Laura as a daughter. On the other hand, we have Maria, sort of the evil clone of Mary, essentially. She even knows stuff that only James and Mary would know, like the videotape that was left in the hotel. She manipulates James, giving him hope that maybe she is Mary, and James, as desperate as he is, falls right into her arms for most of the game. However, Maria is likely another manifestation of James as well, a recreation of what he remembered of Mary, someone who wanted him to always be beside them, always apologetic and loving. Laura is the singular kid roaming this town. She's also looking for Mary the same as James. She even has a note that was somehow recently left by Mary. Laura and Mary seem to have been best friends. Mary even claimed that she would have adopted Laura if things were different. Laura also knows James though, however she doesn't think of him as fondly, often running away from him or simply annoying him every chance she gets. We find out that this is because James may have done something to Mary or just came off wrong to Laura. James and Laura do end up putting their differences aside by the end though, only to break that trust again by James telling Laura that he killed Mary. Eddie is the one kid at school who always got bullied and is now finally getting his comeuppance. We first see Eddie in the apartments throwing up next to a dead body in the fridge. He claims he didn't kill the man, and given the circumstances, it seems believable. However, throughout the story, we see Eddie slowly go insane. He seems to have an inferiority complex and thinks everything and everyone is out to get him, or anything anyone says is derogatory towards him. Now he finds it easier just to remove the people that he deems as problems. James happens to fall under that list, forcing us to kill Eddie. Even though Eddie has killed many by this point, this is the first human that James has killed, at least from what we know up till now. Last but not least, we have Angela, arguably the most damaged of them all. We meet her in the graveyard before entering the town, where she tells us she's looking for her family, but mainly her mom. Later, we find out that she was sexually abused by her father, and we even see the personification of that in the house area under the historic center. Ultimately, Angela is here to face the guilt for what she did to her dad, even though she shouldn't feel any. I said that Angela was the last character, but there's still one more I can give credit to, that being the town itself. Silent Hill is probably the most important character of them all. It brings all these people here to live out their nightmares and face their personal conflicts. Some come to terms with it and come to a revelation. Some don't and have a tragic end. Everyone sees the town differently too. James is looking for his wife while also facing his own inner demons and depression, so that's what he sees. He sees Maria, an altered version of his wife. Not exactly the same, but strikingly indifferent. Pyramid Head, as I mentioned earlier, is what he sees as punishment for his actions. Angela sees Silent Hill as always being on fire, and we get a glimpse of that towards the end of the game. Eddie, being bullied all his life, sees Silent Hill as exactly that. He sees that everyone is against him, and he finds his own way to deal with it. It's no surprise that each character in this game is unique and complex. The story really gets told through the characters, and it's through them that I would even be inclined to play the game again. I mean, that and the... I've said it once and I'll say it again. I love the Silent Hill soundtrack. Every area, every scene is set perfectly by the music. This man, Akira Yamaoka, is a saint sent from the heavens above to bless our ears with this beautiful music. I love tracks like Heaven's Night or Angela's Hell because of the chill yet mourning tones. There are even songs in this game that don't even sound like they're from a horror game. I could praise the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack all day, but I'll hold myself for now. In Silent Hill 1, there were multiple endings, a couple good, a couple bad. Silent Hill 2 fails to stray away from that and brings us 6 different endings. Granted, 2 of them are joke endings. The dog ending is easily the best, but the alien one is cool too. Now, I could talk about the 4 actual endings and how each one delves into a different part of James's emotions, but I won't. And it's not because I don't want to, it's because I wasn't willing to subdue myself to playing the game that many times. And y'all can complain and mourn, but I simply don't care. However, I will tell you how the endings work. It's actually kind of interesting and very different from most games now. Instead of making certain obvious big choices or completing a side quest, Silent Hill 2 works on a point system. Certain things you can naturally do throughout the game can add or take away a point from a different ending. For example, following every command Maria gives you will add a point to her ending, but purposely hitting her will take away a point. The ending I got was the in water ending, and yes, I got it deliberately. And no, I will not elaborate. To get this ending, you have to pretty much act suicidal, stuff like always being in low health or examining the bloody knife acquired from Angela in the apartments. As you may have figured, the ending does end with a suicide. After James realizes he's responsible for the death of Mary, he comes to the conclusion that he's nothing without her. This causes him to leave the town, but purposely crashes before he can get too far. As I said earlier, this is only one of the 4 main endings. Maybe someday I'll go back and get the other ones, but for now, I'll be happy knowing James Sunderland's fate. Not many people seem to mention this, but Silent Hill 2 has a DLC. In certain versions of the game, Silent Hill 2 is packaged with Born from a Wish, which is a sub-scenario where you play as Maria instead of James. It's sorta like in Resident Evil, where you can play as Claire instead of Leon, but in this case it's a prequel, and it's not like the scenarios collide. You start out with Maria looking into a mirror in Heaven's Night, similar to James at the start of the game. Maria is contemplating killing herself, but ultimately opts against it because, like most of us, she's afraid to die. This leads to her wandering the town until we come across a mansion. Walking through the mansion, Maria comes to a door that gets shut before she can open it. A man named Ernest seems to be behind the door, and we learn that he just wants to be left alone. This is until we find a gift left by his daughter, who passed at the age of 7.
Oh no, she fell out the window! Don't move her!
What happened?
Ernest then wants you to find a bottle with white liquid. Anyway, Maria accepts it because what else is she gonna do? After getting the mystery substance back to Ernest and talking to him, Maria opens the door to finally come face to face with him. But to her surprise, there's no one there, only a table with the items she left him. Was Ernest even real in the first place? Is Maria just insane? Probably, but who really knows? What I do know is that I love this short scenario. Honestly, I like it better than some parts of the main game. Throughout the scenario, you're walking through an old mansion very similar to Resident Evil 1. Now, I may be biased. I am. But this is what makes this so cool to me. Me, being a Resident Evil enjoyer, this gives me flashbacks straight to the Arclight mansion, and I love that. I mean, the story here is great too. Not anywhere near the main game, but it's nice to be able to play as Maria. After the scenario is over, Maria just ends up back in Rosewater Park, where she meets James for the first time. Better in Remembrance, the title of this video. Maybe, I might have changed it. But all I mean by that is that I remember the game better than when I actually played it. Playing the game, I was constantly getting bored, yawning even. I mean, I loved the characters and whatnot, but actually playing the game felt like a task more than anything. Despite that, after finishing the game, I remember it more fondly. I think it's because instead of thinking about the gameplay and the atmosphere that I'm not the biggest fan of, I remember the characters and their stories and the soundtrack instead. And that's really the only reason I like the game. Another point I had in the Silent Hill 1 video was that I would rather just watch it as a movie than play the actual game. That point still stands. I would much rather sit down and watch James in a movie as opposed to playing as him in the game. I'm sure a lot of y'all would heavily disagree, and I understand why, but for my own personal taste, this is just how I feel. In conclusion, Silent Hill 2 is a great game. It's just not my favorite. It doubles down on what Silent Hill 1 did, which is a good and a bad thing for me. I love the story, characters, and soundtrack, and I'm glad Silent Hill 2 didn't disappoint in those departments. However, I still can't fully get behind the atmosphere and especially the gameplay. It's just not my cup of tea. I mean, if you're someone who likes slow walking simulator games, then by all means play Silent Hill 2. But if you're like me and find that stuff more boring than anything, I'd say just watch a review or someone else play it. A lot of people say Silent Hill 2 is their favorite or just best horror game, and I definitely can see how some people can say that. For me though, I simply cannot. I can say, however, that even if it's not a game I'll constantly go back to, it's definitely a game I'll always remember.